Good afternoon. I'm Mike Fernandez, Professor of Strategic Communication here at BU, and your host for this strategic communication panel on how to deal with broadcasting interviews, which is part of a continuing series presented by the university's Marketing Communications Department and the Research Office. Essentially to focus and help faculty members communicate their research and expertise in effective, compelling, and accessible ways. Now, our specific goal this afternoon is to help you evaluate broadcast opportunities strategically and engage in interviews in a way that you have some confidence about what you're dealing with. Said another way, our celebrated panel of professionals today will provide you with kind of tricks and tips for broadcast interviews that will help you become the sought-after expert in your field. That said, I will allow each of our guest panelists to introduce themselves, and then we'll just jump right into it. So, Lindsay.
Hi, everyone. Welcome, and thank you for joining us. I'm Lindsay Schwimmer. I'm a media relations strategist at Pan Communications, which is a local PR firm here in Boston. And one of the key components of my role is prepping executives and my clients to appear on air for broadcast opportunities, as well as working closely with producers at broadcast outlets to secure interviews and segments. So obviously really excited about the topic and looking forward to hear the questions that you guys have.
Unless she be too humble, she's had her clients appear on like the Today Show and Good Morning America. So.
Hello, everybody. I'm Ariane Chernock. I'm an associate professor in the history department here at Boston University. And I have become something of a go-to person on the British monarchy. So you'll probably be seeing me about the royal baby, or I call it the Brexit baby. So it's going to be a busy winter and spring, I'm afraid.
So I'm Joe Bergantino. I'm the co-founder and executive director emeritus of what's called the New England Center for Investigative Reporting, which is based here at BU and at WGBH. Before that, I worked for 22 years at WBZ TV here in Boston as an investigative reporter. Worked 5 years at ABC News as a correspondent. Early in my career, worked in Miami at the Washington Post-owned television station. Journalism has been my life since I've been about 10 years old, when I started my first neighborhood newspaper at that age. I also teach. I've been teaching at Boston College for 24 years, teaching journalism. I was a clinical professor of journalism here at BU, and nowadays, between taking jazz courses at the New England Conservatory, I travel the world training journalists how to do investigative reporting, and was detained in Russia once about 4 years ago in St. Petersburg for a day. But I'm here with you now.
Good. We're glad for that.
I don't know if I want to follow that. Hi, I'm Sarah Grucha. I'm a communications specialist at the Ash Center. The Ash Center is the largest research center at Harvard Kennedy School, so I'm from just across the river. I focus on digital communications. I do a little bit of PR work, but part of the reason I'm here today is I also produce a podcast called This Week in Dystopia for faculty over at the Kennedy School. We focus on the promise and perils of democracy, but I've spent a lot of my time both producing podcasts and helping faculty get their research out through podcasts.
Hi everyone, my name is Rachel Appal. I'm the AVP of PR and Social Media here at BU in the Marketing Communications Department. So here we work on an integrated team doing both public relations and social media for the university at large. We also very much focus on promoting BU's research and thought leadership and expertise. And today we're going to be chatting a little bit about kind of the new broadcast opportunities that may not first come to mind, so primarily Facebook Live.
Great. So in the world that I grew up in, I think probably Joe grew up in, I can remember when broadcast meant 3 television stations and a few radio networks, right? Well, clearly it's changed dramatically since. And in some ways, if you went and did an interview back in those days, it was a little bit like playing the New England Patriots, during the playoffs. It was one and done. And if people didn't catch you, they would never catch you. So the world of broadcast today, of course, is much different. It's not only multi-channel, it's also multi-platform. And whereas people would only hear and see you during the live radio and TV interview, now people can retrieve you online anytime they want to. That multi-platform, multi-channel world is also often in need of smart, diverse content. That's where all of you come in. There are many more venues and ways in which you can share your research and your expertise and your information than ever before. And in a share economy, if you have information that is timely, valued, newsworthy, rather than reaching just 100 folks in your neighborhood, all of a sudden you have this huge megaphone that allows you to reach literally millions across the globe. So how do we do that? How do we do it effectively? And how do we set ourselves up for success? And I guess what I want to do is almost start with the end in mind, given the fact that the world has so vastly changed. Rachel, I know you've helped people navigate broadcasting online, if you will, through tools like Facebook Live. What's that like? How does it work? And how does one get engaged?
Sure. So what's really nice about Facebook Live, and just as a bit of background and definition, so Facebook Live is starting or launching a live video from any Facebook page, and every Facebook page, whether it's a personal page or whether it's a business page, has the ability to do that. And so one of the things that's nice about that is that it's lower stakes. So especially if you're just wanting to dip your toe in kind of the broadcast pool, it's a way to do it in an area that can maybe be a little bit more comfortable. And how we really engage with it is we promote them in advance, and we ask people to leave their questions in advance in the comments, as well as to tune in and ask questions during a broadcast. So it gives followers an opportunity to engage in real time with an expert, and kind of cuts out the middleman of the media. So you can own your channel with deciding what page you go live from. You can really target your audience because you're basically reaching followers who have already opted in to receive that type of content. So it's a great way to also, if you want to start doing more broadcast, excuse me, to build up kind of your clip reel or communication reel. If you are looking to do more of that, so oftentimes producers will ask if you have anything you can send them. And this is an area that it's something that you didn't really have to wait for someone else to ask you to be on something. It's something you can own on your own and get better at it, and then send them, send along something that you really feel does a good job.
There's a little bit of safety in it too, right? Yes. Because there's not a huge audience for these specific channels.
Yeah. Yep.
Yeah. So, Sarah, I can remember growing up and listening to the radio. And when I'd listen to the radio, I really loved these sort of long format interviews. And those then kind of dwindled and went away. But now we have something called podcasting. And all of a sudden it's seemingly coming back. It's a little different, but tell us a little bit what those kinds of opportunities are like.
Sure. So podcast opportunities absolutely abound. There's probably about 500,000 podcasts existing right now. You've got about 1 in 4 Americans listening to podcasts. So there's just about a podcast on anything you could possibly want. So that's kind of the nice juxtaposition to like a broadcast news opportunity, is you can get kind of like Facebook Live as specific as you want. And podcasts will range anything from 5 minutes to, like you said, they could be really long form. You can go on for hours and hours and hours. Yeah. So I mean, it's really a wide universe of opportunities. There are very specific like faculty and academic opportunities out there. Something some of you might be familiar with is like the New Book Network. So a podcast platform specifically for faculty books. all they do is interviews on faculty research, and you're normally paired with a host who is faculty as well, so they're very learned in your subject area, to really popular things. Like if you think about the New York Times Daily, so that's like normally a 20-minute podcast on breaking news. Same thing with Up First from NPR. So just about anything you want to do, you can do with podcasts.
Yeah. Well, tell them a little bit about the podcast you work with.
Sure. So, and kind of similar to Facebook Live, podcasting is also an opportunity for you to get your research out and have more control over the message. So the podcast that I produce right now is with faculty at the Kennedy School named Christopher Robichaux. He's a senior lecturer, and he's an ethicist, but our podcast is a little more generally focused on democracy topics. So what we choose to do on a weekly basis is engage with various faculty from around Harvard University, outside of the university, sometimes practitioners, to discuss areas tied to their research, tied to Chris's research, in a really digestible format. That's the approach that we've taken. I've also worked with faculty from University of Virginia, who has a history-focused podcast where she does interviews with other faculty. Sometimes it's her and other faculty, and they talk amongst themselves about how they can tie their research to news. So it's really whatever you want, and it's a very low-cost option as well. So it's something that you can do in your office, probably with the laptop that you have. You can learn the editing skills in, I'd say, about 2 hours.
That's great. That's great. Now, when we think more broadly, I mean, I know at least when I normally think about doing a broadcast interview or I'm working with a client, we're usually talking television. And as we're talking television and kind of working through it, the thing that I think a lot of professors would have in their mind is, how do you do this? How do you even get known, and how do you decide how to take what opportunity? And I guess, Joe, it would be interesting to share from the broadcaster side, the reporter side, what are people really looking for, and how should somebody treat that opportunity?
Well, we're looking for someone who's an expert, right? Who really knows their material well. We used to get little pamphlets from universities in the area. I mean, the Kennedy School had one. I had it on my desk for years and years that had all the experts for various topics that we would likely, do a story on. And so I'd look at the book. Do they still do that?
I don't think so. It's all online.
It's all online, right? Yeah, everything's online. And that's how we'd find people. And we would pre-interview them because we wouldn't want to choose someone who was boring. So I'd talk to them on the phone. I'd ask them questions, see if they have expertise in the area that we're looking for. Also, what they sound like. Do they sound animated? Do they sound like they're enthused about their topics? I'm looking for people who have energy and enthusiasm and can deliver in a concise, simple way for a general audience the information that they have. I think, and to experts in academics too, probably tend to be, certainly into the subject they're studying, but also perhaps a little more complex, thinking more complex than what I'd be looking for in a soundbite, right? For a TV piece I was doing. And at ABC News, when I worked for Nightline, when it was actually an actual show with Ted Koppel and an actual news show that people cared about, we would do very long stories, and we would oftentimes, most times, be looking for experts. There was even one occasion where I called my history professor from Holy Cross, undergraduate, to get him to comment on something in a piece I was doing.
How did you do?
He did well, yeah. He added some context. It was good. He was a great professor. So you're looking for people who know what they're talking about and who can deliver it in a simple, concise, energetic, enthusiastic way. Because, all of this, whether it's a podcast or whether it's a newscast or whatever it is, or anything in broadcasting, has, for better or worse, an entertainment requirement to it, right? And some of the best podcasts that are out there are the mystery podcasts. One called Serial, The Globe and BUR have collaborated on this, whatever new information there is around the Gardner heist, from years ago. So it's, I think there is that piece that you're kind of I think you need to think about yourself as a person delivering information, but also at the same time entertaining people in some way.
So Ariane, on the other side of the equation, you didn't write your PhD dissertation on something that all of a sudden would go, ding, we need to talk to her about British royalty. So how did you look at this initially, at the potential opportunities, and get over sort of general fear and sort of refocus yourself on a game plan in order to start doing these interviews?
I guess I would start by just kind of building on your point that to engage, you have to be engaging. And that is something I've learned over time. I'm not suggesting that I'm always successful at it either. But when my colleagues ask me how I've been able to do so much commentary around various royal births, I think it's that a lot of the pre-interviews that you were talking about, I was able to say, well, they're certainly not going to name the baby Northwest, you know? And I think there was a kind of refreshing pause where they thought, oh my gosh, this is a historian who can also reference a little bit of popular culture. You know, that's good. We'll take that. You know, so you have to come in ready to entertain as well as to share information. To your point, though, I have to say I came into this in a fairly passive way. I was more reacting than kind of choosing a topic that I thought would allow for media engagement. I was actually surprised. I'm writing a book about Queen Victoria and the women's movement. And I think just the Queen Victoria there provided that way into history of monarchy more broadly. And once I'd done a few interviews, I was not in the Rolodex anymore, I guess. I was, you know, whatever. I was on people's phones, and then, you know, now they can see my name when they're searching for related stories. And so there was a real snowball effect. And so I do very little work now to seek those opportunities. They kind of come to me.
Yeah. So Lindsay, what's been your experience as you've worked with clients and sort of help people in their pursuit of trying to get their message out?
Yeah, sure. So, you know, when a client comes to me and says that they're interested in broadcast, my recommendation is always to start with radio. It's a little bit more low stakes. You know, you're not on TV, so you're not conscious of looking at the camera or, you know, how your appearance is or having to go through hair and makeup. So, you know, you can have your prep materials in front of you, research to glance over, and it's a little bit more of a comfortable situation. Also, to your point, the format is a little bit shorter now. Compared to, you know, broadcast, which can be either more a soundbite form or a longer form segment. And also, you know, the nature of broadcast, radio broadcast in particular, is very conversational. So there's that more, you know, human interest, human element to it, allowing you to really kind of have a dialogue with the hosts on the show. So in terms of, you know, my counsel to clients, I think, you know, broadcast is a great area to explore. I think radio is a good kind of first step to get your feet wet, get comfortable hearing yourself in that kind of limelight, so to say. So, yeah, I think, you know, radio itself is, you know, there's tons of opportunities. I think broadcast in general is a great way to kind of get your word out and your research out, especially with all the podcast opportunities coming out.
All of you in some vein have hit upon this notion that you have to prepare. Sometimes you have to practice, maybe do a pre-interview. And I can remember days when I was a U.S. Senate press secretary ages ago, and I purposely would take the senator and have him do print interviews first, with the idea that once he had gone through that process 2 or 3 times, he got sharper, he got more succinct, he better understood, you know, what were the 2 or 3 messages he was to convey, and he did them much better. What's been your experience as a reporter watching these people do interviews?
Well, I think people do improve over time. Hopefully that's in all aspects of life. You know, I think I remember when I went to journalism graduate school, and I remember the first time hearing my voice and just like being shocked by it. I was disturbed by it. And so I think that part of the training process for this, if you're going to do broadcasting, whether it's radio or television, is that you actually maybe record yourself on your cell phone and listen to yourself. And you can then kind of get a sense of what you sound like, obviously, and try to improve that. And what it usually means, when we were trained when broadcast news was more of what it was in the past in terms of delivery, we were trained to think about commercials. How would that line be delivered for a television commercial, right? With enthusiasm, energy, et cetera, that I talked about earlier, so that you'd then go back and perhaps inject that into what you were going to say and then try it again. But I think, beyond the tone of it and the energy of it, what's most important is that you have something to say. That's of value, right? And really knowing what that is, and writing those points down, and if you're going to be on television, you can't look at them because that would be a little bit odd. So you should memorize them, right? Mm-hmm. But not try to repeat them verbatim, because then you'll make a mistake and that won't look good either. So I think generally speaking, practice is important.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
And do people, clearly people get hung up about things like eye contact and, what's the right modulation of one's voice and what should I wear? You want to comment a little bit on that?
I think what you wear is not as important as it used to be.
Yeah.
No offense to the tie, but I think ties are out. I think we would come to in the 21st century. I think anchors now are thinking about not wearing ties. So I think, so for men, obviously, I don't think it's as important. I think what is important is to think about the fact that you want nothing to distract from what you're saying. So if your hair is a mess, all the viewers, if it's television, obviously, all the viewers are going to be focusing on is like, what's wrong with that hair, right? Why did they comb their hair, right? So that you don't want that to get in the way, or why did they look, pale or something? So you want to get all of that out of the way, so you don't have to worry about it, right? I think that's important. With eye contact, when you're, the old advice for people in television, if it's a live shot where you're looking directly into a camera, like a lot of remote shots are done where the expert's brought in and they're just looking straight into the camera, then you have to think about the camera, if it's there actually, or whether it's hidden, is your best friend, and you're just talking to your best friend, right, in an intelligent way. And your eye contact with the reporter, at a national television show, if you're on the set, there are lots of people around, there are camera people, there are other people. The only person you need to be focusing on is the person you're talking to, and not be ever looking around.
And they'll capture you, right?
Yeah.
The camera.
Yeah, so you don't want to be looking to the cameraman or looking to the producer who's standing to the left. You never want to do that. It's just you and the person who's interviewing you are the only two people in the room. And that's the way the viewer is seeing it, right?
Yeah, now, Lindsay, a lot of your clients also do radio interviews, and the storytelling in that environment is a little bit different than what one would do on television. Talk about that a little bit.
Yeah, so for TV, what's critical is talking in short, concise sound bites. You'll notice if you watch, a Squawk Box or Power Lunch, they move very quickly, and they're jumping around from topic to topic, and, the host will kind of fire off questions. The expert has, 2-line sentences to get what they want to get in, and then they move on to the next. So whenever I'm counseling clients or executives right before they go on air, I say, what are the 3 things you want to get across? Bullet them out, and if you accomplish all 3, then we'll call it a win, because the way that the show moves so quickly, just making sure you know exactly what you want to get across is kind of the key there. For radio, like I said, it's a little bit more conversational, so you're not going to get as much of that, rapid fire questioning as you might on a business-focused TV show. But then thinking, more nationally, when you think of of a nightly news show or the Today Show or Good Morning America, for example, the nature of those shows are a little bit different, where they'll do longer form segments, bring on an expert to speak to, whatever footage or coverage that they've captured, and that's, more of a consumer audience. So just kind of the tone and focus of the conversation.
So a very big key in this is knowing your audience and also knowing that format, because the format can be very, very different. And I would love to talk with you a little bit, Ariane, about the fact that what is it like, and it's got to be different from when you're talking about, royal babies and weddings to when you're talking on a more technical topic that maybe you've written about. What is that like, and how do you get your head around framing it? Because especially on television, where you've got a short amount of time, and sometimes you're sitting there and you know a lot more than what you can possibly get to in the context of that interview. So how do you set up for that?
I think, to my point earlier about engagement, it's about knowing what you want to say and really coming up with those key talking points and staying on task and not straying. Figuring out also how you can meaningfully engage rather than just engage is really, really critical to that process. You want to make sure that you're adding value when you engage with the media, and that's something I'm always thinking about, whether I'm pursuing a media opportunity or being asked to participate. As a historian with a technical knowledge, do I bring something different to the conversation, or do they just need an academic to agree essentially with a point that they're trying to establish, at which point I would be perhaps less inclined to participate. So it's also about remembering as the expert that you have control and agency and that you can help to kind of set the parameters of the conversation.
So, Joe, if I'm a professor and I think I've got something worthy to share, how do I get in that world where I'm known, or I want to pitch an angle based on something I already see in the news, which happens to hit the area that I've been studying in and writing about? Any tips there?
I think there are a couple of different ways. One is to make sure the public relations people here know you and know what you're doing, and know that you're an expert in a certain area, where if they get a phone call, because that's sometimes is where the connection is made from the news person to you is through the public relations office. So make sure they know you and what you're doing. And then, the other thing is to be proactive about reaching out to news shows that would be the most likely ones to be interested in what you have to say and what your expertise is. How many scientists are here in this room that work in the sciences? Mm-hmm. So if, depending what area of science, I would, Living Lab, WGBH, which does a lot of environmental stuff. You have the Innovation Hub, which actually has a lot of experts. It's a national show on PRI run out of GBH. They're always interested in more than the sciences, a broad range of topics. You've got NOVA. And in those cases, you'd reach out to the producer. You send them an email or send them a letter saying, here's what I'm working on, wanting to be if this might be an interesting topic for part of a show you're doing. If there is, I'd love to at least talk to you on the phone and talk more about what I'm doing. I think it's being proactive. Then when there's breaking news, like yesterday, yesterday the president gave an hour and a half news conference that was probably the most unusual moment, one of the most unusual moments in political history. So if you are a professor at the College of Communications, you might want to, reach out to a broadcast outlet and say, look, if you're looking for someone to talk about this devolving relationship that he has now with the news media, I'd be happy to weigh in on it. Or, so I think you look for breaking news opportunities. Certainly, yesterday was a day where political science experts from the Kennedy School, from any university, people were looking for local news stations, especially looking to talk to political science experts about what the meaning of this and the impact going forward beyond the midterm election day. So I think you have to be paying attention to the news, right? Mm-hmm. So that you can insert yourself into breaking news events, but also, spend time looking around to see what shows out there fit what your expertise is, and be proactive about reaching out to those shows.
You touched on something there that I think is interesting to probe a little bit more, is the difference about going after something that's national and then going to something that's local. What's kind of the difference there? Obviously, I would assume the networks have a certain coterie of people they're already going after, and there might be many more opportunities local.
Yeah, I mean, if you watch cable news, you see the panels, they keep getting bigger and bigger and bigger. Pretty soon they won't have enough room for all the people, in the picture. So they have their stable of people, and they are mostly, people who've worked in the White House under different administrations who end up being sort of political commentators. Then there's some people like David Gergen who's done that, but also is at the Kennedy School and is a well-known. He does teach, right? Professor. So we all know who he is. So there's that piece of it. But on the national broadcasts, but when you look at the local television stations, they're always looking to line up people, whether it's for election night, the royal wedding, right? Were you a commentator at the royal? Yeah.
Not at, but locally.
No, locally,
yes.
Yeah, not at, sorry. That would have been really nice. So people, the local TV stations are looking to change that up a little bit too. So if you see someone all the time on television, it doesn't mean there's not room for you to insert yourself in that particular topic area, because the stations are always looking for somebody new, so they don't have the same person over and over again.
Yeah.
I would also say along the same ideas when you're thinking of online opportunities as well. If you have a new research paper coming out, you want to think through who's funding that. Is there a local organization that you partnered with on the research? Is the journal that's publishing the research, do they have a Facebook page? Because it's kind of the same thought process that you go through. They're all looking for content across their online footprint, whether it's on Facebook or if they're looking for something for a blog or a news site. Those are other opportunities that you can think about engaging with audiences, and it may not be, as big of an audience as MSNBC or CNN, but it's a very qualified audience, and it's people who are following them because they're very invested in the topic. So you want to just make sure that you're applying kind of that same mindset across different channels as well.
Also, when you think about the news and media in general, you shouldn't rule out print, because print has essentially a broadcast component on its website, right? So if you're anybody here into the biosciences, the biotech, and that area, so you reach out to STAT at the Boston Globe, and they do video interviews too that appear on the website, so that so then you get both, and then you're kind of reaching a specific audience that you probably want to reach. But one of the things that I realized early on when we established the New England Center for Investigative Reporting is we were doing pieces, and still do, for the Boston Globe, the New York Times, Washington Post, and I realized early on that when you have a story on the front page of the Boston Globe or New York Times, it doesn't mean every person who picks up the New York Times that day is going to read it.
Right.
When you are sitting in front of a television set and the news is on, unless you need to go to the bathroom, or you're cooking, or you're doing something, you're going to sit there and watch it. So you're going to you can almost be assured that when you're on TV, or even on the radio sometimes, because people are in their car mostly when they're listening to the radio, that you have a captive audience. You don't know. That's sort of the downside of print, is that you really don't know, except they can measure the online hits. You don't really know how many people are engaging with you as an expert in that story you're in.
Yeah. Sarah, thinking about, how we position people for broadcast interviews and the like, and when you talked about podcasting before, you were talking about, the actual creation of a podcast and kind of managing that process. But is there something to kind of pitching to get on certain types of podcasts?
Sure. So something that I think is applicable to all of us that kind of underlies what people have been saying in terms of tips is just it's timeliness, and that applies to podcasts, to broadcasts, to print, to Facebook Live. It's, making yourself available at a time in which there's a lot of interest, and I think everyone here can speak to this. The timeline sometimes between what we think about working in academia and, the media timeline, completely different. We tend to work a little slower sometimes, and like even a podcast opportunity, it's that day, because you can turn around a podcast in a day, a week. A broadcast, it's going to be the hour. Same thing with radio. So if you've got a timely topic, just like you would reach out to a broadcast booker, you can reach out to a podcast producer. I think some of the difference is that for some of the smaller publications, you have a greater chance of actually dealing with the host. The host and producer might be the same person, so you have more opportunity there also to shape your story, whereas broadcast is probably pretty set. But on a podcast, as the guest, you're going to create more of the storyline. So if you've got a good story, there's kind of a greater chance to sell yourself there.
Well, story is the key, actually. Because storytelling is the key.
Yeah.
So if you're working in some obscure area, like on cellular research,
yes.
Okay, then the goal is to turn that into a story. Because when you think about the people some of the brilliant people who've been on television, there's what's the fellow from in New York at the museum who has his own science show, Gross? Yes, right.
Yeah.
Brilliant man, and a brilliant storyteller. And you go back in time and look at those people who've been able to take complex, material that if you pitched it on its face, somebody would say, well, who's going to understand that? Or
their eyes would glaze over.
Your eyes would glaze over immediately. It's just describing it. So it's all about turning something like that into a story that people can then engage with, right? I mean, podcasts, really are most noted for that, because you're in your car and you're listening, or you're walking around or listening to this engaging story, and that's really what you need to be thinking about. That's what all journalists do. All journalists are delivering information and telling stories and engaging. I mean, the good journalist does.
Well, and for those in the sciences, I think a key thing is sometimes you're working on something that's original breakthrough research, but it's so detailed that it's hard to convey, and somehow you have to turn that into, so what could be the future application? And how could that make somebody's life or something in the world easier as a consequence of that?
Yeah.
So as we think about all of these choices, and particularly you with clients, how do you prioritize? If you have a client who's eager to tell their business transformation story and whatnot, how do you decide? Do you do this broadcast interview on television? Do you take them to radio? Do you take them to podcasts or what? How do you make those decisions?
Yeah, I mean, for my clients, it's usually based on the executive that would be the spokesperson. So what's their level of comfort for broadcast? Again, kind of what's the temperature of what's going on in the news? What's the news cycle like? For example, I work with a local company here in Boston. They do cybersecurity. It's called Rapid7, and the CEO, Corey Thomas, was scheduled to go on TV on Monday morning at 6 a.m. On Squawk Box. This was a few weeks ago. And on Friday afternoon, the producer told me that there was breaking news and Facebook got hacked, and she'd like him to talk about only that. So you have moments like that where he was set up to speak about his vision for the business and what they were doing recently, new research, and it completely flipped. So there's times like...
So how did you manage that with the client?
We prepped him to speak to the news, and he was able to weave in some of that messaging that he was prepared to speak to kind of say, this is why...
So the news became the hook for the story that he wanted to deliver.
Yeah. So, I mean, it's that there's a risk that you run with broadcast in that respect, because, we were able to make it work out, and we were able to make it a win in that, that same messaging came through. But in another circumstance, we either A, would have had to pass on the opportunity, or it could have completely derailed kind of that initial goal setting that we had in mind. But I think, it kind of depends on the client. I like to kind of do a balance between all three. I think there's value in print, there's value in online, there's value in podcasting, broadcast radio. So it kind of depends what the focus is. If it's research, it might, print and online are great options as well because you'll get that full story. Whereas broadcast sometimes, it needs to have a timely element. So, I think there's value in all outlets.
So Ariane, as you've done these interviews, has it had an impact on how you think of what you do and your research? Has it elevated your game? Talk a little bit about that.
I feel much more comfortable speaking in public now than I did, which this is the unintended and happy consequence of media engagement. I also feel that it's shaped my teaching in some really productive ways. I think I'm a much more relaxed professor. I'm much more flexible in the classroom because I've had to deal with these, CNN experiences. And I also find that it's important, our careers tend to have a different pace, as you were saying. I think it's nice to mix it up a little bit and learn how to really write deadline-driven pieces and really respond to the news in its daily cycle, as well as, thinking about books and lab work, which often we think of in terms of years. So I think it's, I would say coming out, it's not the other side, but years into this, I'm much happier with my experience in academia for the media engagement.
Yeah, and Joe, you've been a professor as well. So I guess, did you see some changes as you were kind of on the other side of the camera, maybe?
Yeah, well, I think of my classroom teaching as sort of being on television. So I produce in my mind, I produce my class.
So we should come see the show, right?
Yeah, right. So I divide it up into topic areas. I mix it up. I don't lecture for long periods of time because I just know.
So you think of it like segments.
Yeah, I think of the class as segments, and I also think about my own delivery when I'm talking to the students, right? So that's all of that. I mean, I guess for better or worse, all of my years in television news is now who I am in terms of how I whether I'm at a dinner with 4 people or in front of a classroom, it is just who I am. Yeah, could be worse, but yeah. Right.
So Sarah, as you've worked with professors at Harvard, what have you witnessed as they've gotten more engaged?
I think it's dependent on who you work with. I think you kind of hit the nail where you've said this has shaped your experience. You find that some professors are really engaged, and once they become engaged, they tend to do more. And some who really just don't have a lot of interest in these kinds of opportunities. But I do think that once people have experiences with some of this new media, like Facebook Live, like podcastings, they tend to get a little hooked. It's fun. On the new media side, it's really conversational. It's something that you can send around that can augment your teaching, that you can then make available to. And that's the beauty of broadcast and print, is it just adds to your portfolio. It's a different type of content for students and your peers to engage with that's not the long form book. So I think people get hooked. Yeah.
So before we go to your questions, what I want to do is I want to go down the line here and ask each one of them for their top 2 or 3 tips or tricks. And then once we finish with that, just raise your hand. I know we've got a microphone to take people's questions, and then we'll have at it. So let me start with you, Lindsay. Are there a couple of tricks that you'd like to share with them?
I think it goes back to what I was saying earlier. I think setting up, or by preparing, setting up the 3 things that you want to get across when you approach any interview, whether it's on the phone for a print or online opportunity, whether it's on TV or radio. I think having that kind of bulleted out format really helps executives prepare, and then they, when they get live, they know what they need to hit on, and if they can weave in those 3 messages throughout the conversation, then it's a great result.
I would say be purposeful, know when to say no, and Finally, if you are going to venture into TV, you want to ask about makeup, hair, all of those kinds of very technical questions. Sometimes that's provided, and I've discovered in good and bad ways, sometimes it's not. And it's just important to know in advance. Yeah.
Unless you're like me, you just have a face for radio.
So in terms of the actual interview, I think it's important that you think simple, right? Simple, concise, direct. And that if you need to practice that ahead of time, that's important to do. And explain it like you were going to explain it to, a 15-year-old, right? And then the other thing that I mentioned earlier is that you don't think about waiting for the phone call, that you be proactive. I mean, you're doing valuable research, your work is valuable. I would hope that all of you want the rest of the world to know what you're doing and to learn from it. And that means, as I said earlier, reaching out to producers of shows where what you're doing would be interesting for people to hear about. And also, I think it's important to note what I said earlier, that it's all about sort of putting this in the context of telling a story, right? Telling a story, whether no matter what the topic is. That's important that you realize that people are listening to you not only for information, but to be engaged and entertained.
So building on top of that, it's absolutely important to be prepared, but I just can only strongly caution you to please do not read off your notes. On broadcast, it's a little easier to not do that, but sometimes when you're either in the podcast booth or if you're doing something over Skype, it's tempting to have that paper in front of you, but people can really hear it in your voice. They know when you're just reading off a piece of paper. And the second thing is, if you're working on kind of a lower end production where you're doing something over Skype, maybe you're even taking a phone call, try and find a quiet place. I know that it sounds silly, but that will make a world of difference in your interview. And I think the biggest mistake that people make, and I'm sorry, you'll start hearing it now that I've mentioned it, is they'll take calls in their office with the AC on, and you hear it in the background the entire time. It's just this fuzz. So just tune your ears and try and find a quiet place.
I would say for Facebook Live, one of the pros is that you get to own the story and position it, and you're kind of, jack of all trades, running the whole production. The con of that is you're jack of all trades and running the whole production. So a few things you want to think about in advance are really where you would want to host it. So again, what kind of partnerships, associations do you have that can help promote it? Perhaps you want to do it on their page versus your school's page, depending on what the topic is. And either way, you would want other people driving to it because you don't really have that network or that following built in. You need to create that a little bit yourself. As well, there are a few very inexpensive pieces of equipment that can make a really big difference. So there is a tripod for your cell phone, and it just keeps the shot very steady. They're about $15 on Amazon. They're very much worth the investment. Also, directional mics that you can plug into your cell phone. It makes a really big difference. Like what Sarah was saying, it's that quality that you're not distracted. People are really just accessing your message versus everything that's happening around you. And then one thing that is good to know, there is an only me function on Facebook Live. So you can kind of give it a whirl and see how it goes and watch it yourself before you're doing it to a larger audience. So it's, again, a nice way to just get some practice in. And then the last thing is you're also, unless you're working with someone else, responsible for writing kind of the promo, right, the description of the post. So you want to make that really interesting and snappy and also understandable. So someone reads it, they can understand what kind of question they would want to ask you, or even giving them prompts about different things that you could talk about. So again, you're kind of owning your whole story, which has a lot of very positives, but maybe requires a little bit more upfront work from you or whoever you're partnering with on it.
So the session is really all about you. So what kind of questions do you have? I have a question right up here front. There's the mic. The mic's right there.
So thank you very much. I would be interested in any advice any of you would have about approaching print journalists or radio or TV or podcast producers in terms of what to say, to grab their attention because they're busy, distracted people, often scrambling at the last minute to get something produced, and how often you might contact them. Every month, every week. Don't want to be a pest. What's your advice?
Let's start with the former journalist here in the middle.
Yeah, you don't want to be a pest. That's true. And I think that, again, you really, if you're going to be reaching out to people, right, you want to pick the right people. So you don't pitch something to somebody who's completely going to be uninterested. And the pitch has to be, really concise. I'm doing this. This is the potential impact. This is why people would be interested. Here it is. And again, simple, concise, clear terms. What is your field? What's your field?
Business communication.
Business communication. Okay. Well, you should be an expert in this.
Well, I've some already.
Right. So you'd be reaching out to people to like business shows, yeah, and wanting to talk about which part of business communications. That's a big area, right?
Public speaking. Business writing. Media interviews.
Yeah. So you're talking about pitching. So some skill that you want to teach. Is that right?
I'm a maverick here in this audience because I'm interested in soaking up any wisdom.
Sure. Sure.
But for example, I was very involved in an effort last few years, to oppose a natural gas pipeline. Volunteer neighborhood activists. And we were always trying to get TV reporters, radio reporters, print journalists
interested
to cover what we were doing.
Right.
Events that often happened at the last minute. We had some success.
Really?
But we were, realized we were up against a lot of competition, late-breaking news. It's a bit different from what the faculty here is involved in, but.
Yeah, I mean, that's.
But I would love to hear from any of you if you think of an example of something that really caught your eye, a communication from someone who wanted some coverage.
Well, in the business communication space, I mean, I think the most interesting is when there's a mistake or a faux pas made by a CEO or a senior executive. That's where I think the sweet spot is for someone with your background. Because what will happen is some of the shows that you deal with from a business perspective, there was now I can't even remember how many years ago it was, but there was an introduction of one of the iPhones that was fraught with problems. And Steve Jobs got, crucified for it. And television stations were looking for people who could analyze what he said, whether he was answering the question that the consumers wanted answered, what kind of response, was it timely enough, was it on point, to the extent that you would be able to address those things. That would have been very smart at that particular point in time.
Yeah, the first thing that came to mind was like the whole Uber debacle.
Right.
Like that could have been a moment where you could say, here's where he could have done something different. Here's, you could kind of analyze the situation and either make recommendations or provide strategy or things like that.
Oh, thank you.
I was just going to say, depending on what kind of, I think events are really hard to turn people out for. A lot of times it's just people are spread really thin and kind of getting to the event, covering the event, getting back, it eats up a lot of their day. So I would think through too, what is the event about, and is there something else that you can contribute to them that kind of gets at the point of what the event is going to get at? So is it an op-ed, is it a contributed piece, is it an interview on a timely topic that would be discussed there, but you're not asking people to come join you at the event. You're kind of bringing the story to them, and through that you can work in the event, especially if it's a local outlet. But yeah, turning people out for events can be tough.
Great. Joyce?
Thank you all for being here. I have a question about, probably for Joe and Lindsay more than anyone. I study an unfortunately very timely and rather controversial topic. I work on the politics of gun control in the U.S. in the 20th century. My question is, when one is on maybe on a panel or giving an interview or maybe a soundbite, what do you do when you confront hostility from other panelists or even from the general public at large? Any tips or tricks?
Yeah, I mean, with broadcast, it's tough because, whereas in print you could have the option to not answer it, or to say, I'm not comfortable. With broadcast, you kind of can't
rough and tumble.
You can't just ignore it. So, I think my recommendation would be, stick to what you're comfortable with, what your messaging is. Kind of always try to tie back to that. You don't have to answer, whatever the response is you're getting. You don't have to respond to it head on. You can kind of block and tackle, as we kind of call it, and then try to revert back to what you're committed to and what your message is. That would be my biggest tip.
And staying cool. Keeping your composure. Even if you're going to say something like, people are dying, and they're dying like every other week they're being killed because of guns. If you're going to say that, say it without yelling and saying like you're crazy. Saying it in a way that's strong, engaging, but not over the top. I think you should watch yesterday's news conference, because
everything they did did not do that.
Yeah.
Or right. Watch what some of the reporters did, right? Because I think that, to your point, we grew up in an era where people used to say that television is a cool medium.
Yeah.
And by and large, not always the case, but by and large, the people who do best are the people who kind of keep their cool and keep their focus.
I would just lastly say to reach out to the communications department. Are you at SPH or?
No, I'm actually in the history department.
Your history department? To CAS or our central Marcom, because we work with folks on bridging techniques, which is what everyone is saying, which is how do you very quickly acknowledge the question, answer it, and then pivot back to what you want to say in a way that is not deflecting or getting you off your topic. So there's a handful of different ones that are, and you'll start hearing it now that once you go through them and you practice it when you're watching other interviews. It's amazing how well people how well they do it so naturally. You don't even notice it's really happening.
And you can even put yourself in agreeing with the person on the other side by saying, that's an interesting point, and then pivot to your point. Right? Or finding a phrase that they use and then linking it back to what you're trying to convey.
I have a question about return on investment, or return on effort, if you will, for people who want to get their message out. Twitter is very short form. It's a great tool for journalists because you can communicate with your home, whatever, people, office, very quickly, in very timely manner. For those who want to get, and also it is very short form, but you can include links. The other thing about Twitter is you have to subscribe. You have to have followers, and you are a follower. So I'm wondering if any of you have a comment about how useful it is to try to spread your word through Twitter.
Yeah.
So I think it can be very useful. There's a lot of journalists, a lot of media who use Twitter just to source experts and information. Even though it's short form, I wouldn't say it's short on time investment. To do it well, I think definitely takes some commitment, thought, and some time of your day. But our office does work with faculty about setting up a strategy and figuring out kind of what your main goal is, and then how you want to use the platform. Depending on what area it is, are there certain hashtags? It's following other people, commenting on their work. You certainly don't want to be following the 100% of the time just talking about yourself. Often they talk about the 80-20 rule. 80% of the time you're talking about other people's work and other people's opinions, and 20% of the time you're talking about what you're adding to the conversation. So it can be very effective, but it's not, I wouldn't say it's at the beginning a quick fix. It takes some time to really be thoughtful in setting it up, and then I think once you're comfortable in it, it can produce a lot of good results.
Yeah, and part of being thoughtful about this is thinking about what is your niche. Where are you going to really play? You don't want to use Twitter where it's a spray of everything that interests you. It's everything that you want people to have an interest in that you're ultimately concerned about. And some folks will set up two different accounts, one that's more of a personal account, and then one that's really focused on their discipline of interest.
Yeah, absolutely.
So one of Ariane, I think, tips was to know when to say no, and I was curious about that. For faculty who are novices, how do they know what opportunities to take and which ones to just let pass by?
I'll answer that. So to your point about maybe easing in through print, especially if you're experimenting, I would really, really recommend that. One of the first ways I engaged was through writing my own opinion pieces. And I had total control over that process, and it wasn't live. I didn't have to deal with the unpredictable elements, and I really got to shape how I was contributing, and I got my story out there, and that really helped contribute once I had decided that I was excited about this and wanted to continue. So I would recommend that. One of the scariest and I think biggest mistakes I made, which I still have painful recollections of, was agreeing to go on Anderson Cooper without the vetting that we've been talking about and without the kind of pre-interview. So it was a live panel discussion. We were all in different locations. And I was not being called on as a historian. They really just wanted kind of a more speculative form of engagement. And I felt like it was wrong as soon as it started. And then there was no way out but just to smile and soldier on. And that's a case where I was really lured in by the idea of being on Anderson Cooper. But if we'd actually taken a minute to discuss what I was going to do and what they needed, I would have realized I was not the right person for them.
So getting as much detail as possible is really important. And I think, reporters want you to say no if you're not the right person for the interview, because nobody wants to waste their time, yours or theirs, right? Yeah.
You shouldn't feel obligated just because somebody asked.
Yeah, and I mean, if you're considering an opportunity, and in the case of an Anderson Cooper, it's pretty high stakes, so you completely have control and access to ask for a prep call, or if you have specific questions that you don't feel comfortable addressing, you can make sure to kind of bring that up beforehand, so that when you do take on an opportunity, you're really comfortable and prepared.
I would just also say for faculty at BU, if you have questions or you don't even know what questions to ask about it, to understand, to evaluate it, you can reach out to your communications folks or at Central Marcom. We can either go and get that information and kind of present it to you from how we're hearing about it and talk about pros and cons, or if you know it's something you really don't want to do, we are happy to politely decline on other people's behalf, especially if it's something that makes you feel a little bit uncomfortable. So it can just be someone that's a little bit maybe closer to you, and kind of be basically an interpreter between the outlet and the faculty member. So.
One more. If you're not happy, I'm sorry, this gentleman is seeing his hand. Go ahead. I've asked this question already.
Yes, I think my question's for Sarah regarding podcasts. Sarah, what are the different challenges that one faces when you're doing a podcast just as a one-off, as opposed to one that's part of a series or maybe in a podcast show?
Sure. So that's an easy question, and it's all down to that subscribe button. So similar to Twitter, right? If you have a podcast series and people are subscribed, they get push notifications to their phone every time there's a new episode. So if you can absolutely do a standalone piece of audio content. If you put it on SoundCloud, it can be embeddable, so you can throw it into articles to kind of support that. You can put it on websites, you can share it, but you don't get that user engagement. People won't keep coming back, and you won't have the built-in network, kind of like you would with social. You can push it out via social, but you don't get your own special group.
What's the topic? What's the topic? Computing. What part of computing?
Well, it's research computing for cybersecurity and other types of topics such as that.
I mean, I think a really good option for you could be to do something like guest host an episode. There's a lot of, especially, podcasting is such a big network. There's tons of cross promotion. People go on everybody else's shows. They go on your show. You can guest host. You can guest post. So if you're thinking about just one episode, people are definitely time strapped. So I bet you there's a lot of shows out there that would be more than happy to have you produce something and submit it.
Yeah, and a lot of the news outlets now are doing their own podcasting. As Sarah mentioned, New York Times. The Wall Street Journal runs a bunch of different podcasts, which they'll actually have academics and experts come on and speak about possibly their own research or how it would tie into either breaking news or a broader trend or the future of X, Y, and Z. So that might be another avenue for you to explore.
Yeah, I think researching to find out what podcasts are out there that are in your field, as well as trying to define, obviously there's lots written and discussed around cybersecurity, but trying to find that right niche where you could have that conversation. But I think podcasting is such that you need not necessarily have an ongoing thing, although to the earlier point, if your goal is a larger audience, a community of learners in that space, and you think you have enough to say and people that you can bring on. Because the most successful podcasts aren't podcasts of people just communicating themselves. It's usually they're interviewing other people. And they're going back and forth and thinking about what are the implications of even the initial topic that they're discussing.
So I'm still sitting here trying to figure out what research computing and cybersecurity is. I'm just trying to. Can you just explain it to me? Just curious.
Well, I'm the communications specialist at the Hariri Institute for Computing.
Yeah.
So there's a lot of different kind of areas that are covered under the institute. One being cybersecurity, others being app development, as well as a number of others as well. So there's kind of a broad topic that could probably be gone into with a podcast, or at least participating in a podcast that kind of covers that topic.
Right.
Yeah.
Right.
So is it like app development around cybersecurity issues, or?
Yes, it is.
Yeah. So I think that could be an interesting topic for a number of podcasts that already exist, and so I think it's just matching you up with the right ones.
So if your interview has been taped for later broadcast or publication, and you're not happy with it, you feel your main points weren't put across clearly, or that you're misrepresented somehow, what's your advice on what, if anything, to say to that reporter or broadcaster? General business etiquette here, or any particular advice?
Are you looking at me?
All of you, really.
Yeah, this certainly happens. What happens sometimes is people do an interview and then call you and say, forget about it. I don't want to ever see that on the air ever again, because what I said is trouble. Whatever reason. And I'll say to them, look, if you said something that's incorrect, we'd be happy to come back and talk to you, and you can correct the mistake that took place. That we don't want inaccurate information in an interview that goes out anywhere, right? So, but if you decide afterwards that you got a second, second thoughts about having done it in the first place, and you want to just pull the whole thing, that. First of all, it's theirs.
Right.
Once you've done it, not yours anymore. It's theirs, and unless you know the person who you can kind of cajole to make this decision to basically say no, let's do it all over again. It's not going to be done. I mean, and plus, that person will never call you back again.
That's right. Yeah.
Right.
Yeah. Well, and it's sort of like regular, press relations etiquette. It's like you don't get the opportunity to spend 15 minutes with a reporter and then at the end of it say, oh, what we just talked about, it's all off the record. No, you've already spoken. It's on the record.
Yeah. So if it's off the record, you say that before you start.
That's right.
Right.
In the instance, if it is taped and in the moment you felt really uncomfortable, you might have the opportunity to say to the producer, hey, could we retake that shot and try it again? I wasn't happy with that, but...
you can always do that.
Yeah, but, if it's 2 weeks later and you're like, hey, I'm actually not comfortable, it's not probably going to fly.
Yeah. And in fact, if you're there and you have second thoughts, more times than not, they'll comply unless it's more of an investigative,
right.
Which you've been in the middle of, right? And in those cases, it's no, we set the interview up according to these rules. We went ahead. This is what you said. So it goes back to the relationship you have with the reporter and the tenor of the event that you're being recorded for. Yep.
Hi, my name's Jay, and I have a really specific question. I do lots of interviews. I have no problems with radio, print, things like that. But when I sit 3 feet away from a blank television camera with an earpiece in my ear,
yeah,
they rarely go particularly well. Are there any suggestions when you're in that black room?
Just looking into that camera. Have you
Staring
been
into
there?
the
Have you done
camera.
that?
I haven't. Oftentimes now you're not even looking at a person, right?
Right.
It's sometimes just an X on the wall in my office. I mean, you have to imagine someone friendly. Sometimes I'll put a picture where the X is. That helps me of someone to look at. So I really am imagining that I'm having a conversation.
Yeah, you always have to remember that you're talking to somebody.
Yeah,
So
make it specific.
And the advice always is, think of that as your wife, your significant other, your child, whoever, your best friend, so that you're talking to that person, not some machine.
The problem is I'm trying to remember all the points in my head, the numbers, what I'm trying to get across, and also trying to focus on, there's my wife smiling.
Right. Yeah. Well.
I mean, that may have something to do with the message. Maybe simplify. Maybe you're being overly ambitious and you just want to remember one number. I've had to streamline, and it's not dumbing down, but it is kind of distilling, I think. Or you said talking to a 16-year-old, I think is.
Yeah.
I think that's a nice way. A 15-year-old. That's kind of a nice way of thinking about it. It's distilling ideas so that you feel less pressure to recall, or that impulse to be looking at notes.
And numbers, getting back to numbers just they don't register with people unless there's a graphic to go along with them. Mm-hmm. So if you have numbers that you could be talking about, you could sometimes say to the TV producer, look, I'm going to be talking about some numbers. Maybe you might want to think about creating this graphic that I can refer to, because otherwise it's like in one ear and out the other. Mm-hmm. Unless it's like one number that people might remember. Yeah.
Or you link it to something that's more easily visual to the mind. Right. You say that's akin to, and then provide what that would be like. Ronald Reagan was great at sort of creating some of those kinds of statements.
Mm-hmm.
This is a question for Rachel, and it's about the BU Public Relations Department and their role in fielding media requests or sending out media alerts when there's a topic comes up in the news and you might be wanting to respond to it rapidly. So are journalists coming to you? Are you going to journalists? And how can we let you know about the faculty expertise that we might have that could be a good fit for that?
Yep. So the answer is both. So we have inbound requests coming in from journalists. They'll often come to our department because then we help them kind of shortlist people that they can reach out to. We try to give them people that we know are going to be responding in a timely way. But we also need to know about who those people are, because we do sometimes go to our same bench of folks just because we know that they will respond. There's the faculty expert database that's on our website. So I would say if you have professors, or if you are a professor who's interested in doing more media, you definitely want to have a profile there. The media look to that. We also look to that. So when we're looking for names, that's kind of our first stop. And then if it's really breaking news, just shoot us an email. My colleague Molly runs our BU Experts handle on Twitter, where we've tried to really cultivate a following of media members, and we'll tweet out different experts and link back to their profile page on the faculty database, and let them know that they're available for comment. So we've been doing that recently with some immigration news. We've been tweeting out Sarah Sherman Stokes in the law department. And so I guess just get in touch and let us know. And don't worry about too many emails, because so much of this is very timely. We're never put off by receiving emails. You know, like unlike a producer, you can reach out to us daily. It's fine. So yeah, just let us know.
Other question? One in the back there?
Hi, I'm Joy. Thank you for sharing. Actually, I want to ask, have you ever been into like the media engagement, like public debate, like, no matter in radio or in TV? So actually, will you be given any like head up or things that you can prepare by like from the host prior to the live? And do you think actually it can be the trickiest one of the media engagement? Thank you.
I don't know that. Did you catch that?
So we're talking about a debate format or an interview? A debate format? You know, I think you can always ask the producer or the host or have your communications contact ask for sample questions or topics that they want to discuss. Again, it's like the pre-interview. I think as much information as you can get up front so that you can prepare and really distill that message to a few key takeaways. People really can't remember more than, I would say, 3 tops takeaways and have your message rehearsed. So I would say trying to get as much information on the format and the topics up front, no matter what the opportunity is.
Well, and the tough thing too, and Ariane, you probably have witnessed it around some of these royal events, if they've got 5 or 6 people on camera at the same time, you're almost fighting for your magical 30 seconds. So you really have to be focused on what you're going to deliver. And you might have 3 messages that you'd like to deliver and only get a chance to deliver 1.
They go really quickly, these encounters. You think, you know, you prepare, and then it's just a few sound bites, really.
It's like you get ready for a marathon and all you have is a 40-yard dash.
Does anyone in this room know about the conversation? Raise your hands. Just 1 person, 2 people?
A few people.
Yeah, which is a nonprofit. I think it is is it a nonprofit or for-profit? I'm not sure.
I think it's nonprofit.
Yeah, I think you're right.
Yeah, which the goal being to take all this great research that's being done in universities around the world and bring it to the general public in a way that they understand it. And it's in print. So if you would be assigned a reporter, I think they only have a couple, and Naomi Shalit is one of them here in Boston, who then come in and would talk to you, and then she'd write the story, and then that's another way. It's in print, it's not broadcasting, is it? Or is it?
I think it's just print.
Yeah.
At the moment.
That's another way to kind of dip your feet into this, which is much more controlled, right? It's actually good practice.
I was going to say, I wrote an opinion piece for the conversation that was then picked up by other outlets, which is another aspect of why it's an advantage to start with them. And they're very approachable. And you can get a little more technical in those pieces as well.
Yeah. There are also some trade journals now, even in the sciences, that are trying to give more bite-sized information online. In fact, I have a daughter who actually is an editor of a trade publication, not trade publication, an academic publication that tracks nanotechnology. And they're getting to the point where they're taking snippets from conferences. They're taking, they're doing quick interviews with people associated with their new research that they've just published. So there's lots of different opportunities, and I think they're going to continue to be even more. And sort of the challenge and opportunity for all of you is that, you know, keep looking and keep thinking about how you want to play, because I think the opportunities are only going to continue. And know too that, you know, within the marketing department here at BU, you've got a public relations staff that's ready, willing, and able to help you navigate that space, or at least give you advice in a moment's notice. So it's been terrific being here with all of you. I want to thank all of our panelists, and hopefully you got something out of this.